Victoria Goldberg has never backed down in the face of a challenge. In her 35 years, she was already the owner of a chain of elite restaurants, Golden Age, known throughout New York. Her name did not leave the front pages of glossy magazines, and her appearance at any social event caused a real stir. That evening, as usual, she shone at the annual charity ball at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her Versace dress, costing several tens of thousands of dollars, attracted admiring glances from the guests. Victoria reveled in the attention, deftly maneuvering between groups of businessmen and celebrities, exchanging pleasantries and strengthening ties.
Victoria, darling, it's so good to see you,
came a familiar voice. She turned around and saw James Witrowski, the owner of a rival restaurant chain. His smug smile always annoyed Victoria, but she pulled a duty smile onto her face.
James, what a surprise! I didn't expect to see you at the charity event,
she replied with a faint note of sarcasm in her voice. James laughed.
Oh, Vicky, always so sharp-tongued. But, charity isn't just about money. It's about actually helping people. Though, of course, you're hardly familiar with that.
Victoria felt anger boiling up inside her.
What do you mean?
Well, let's face it,
James continued, sipping his champagne.
You're great at making money and spending it on yourself. But when it comes to actually helping people, to changing someone's life, that's not your field. Wouldn't you agree?
Victoria clenched her fists. She hated it when anyone questioned her abilities.
You're wrong, James. I can change anyone's life if I want to.
Really?
James raised an eyebrow.
Then let's make a bet. You take a random homeless guy off the street and completely change his life in 30 days. If you succeed, I'll donate $1 million to charity in your name. If not, you do the same thing in my name. What do you say?
Victoria knew it was crazy. She knew she shouldn't agree to this ridiculous bet. But pride and the desire to prove herself took over.
Deal,
she said, extending her hand for a handshake. James grinned and shook her hand.
Excellent. We'll get started tomorrow. I'll send my assistant over to document everything. Good luck, Victoria. You're going to need it.
As James stepped back, Victoria felt panic overwhelm her. What had she done? How was she going to fulfill this crazy promise? But it was too late to back out. She took a deep breath and decided that she would handle this challenge, as she had handled every challenge in her life, with unyielding determination and faith in herself. The next morning, Victoria woke up with a heavy head. The events of last night seemed like a distant, unpleasant dream, but a call from James's assistant quickly brought her back to reality. The bet had started and the clock was ticking. Victoria decided to act immediately. She dressed in the simplest clothes she could find in her wardrobe, the jeans and sweater she usually wore to yoga class. Without makeup and with her hair in a simple ponytail, she looked nothing like the glamorous businesswoman she was used to being. She took to the streets of Manhattan feeling uncomfortable and unsure how to find the right homeless person. What should she even say to her? These questions swirled in her head as she wandered the streets, taking in the faces of passers-by. Hours later, when Victoria was ready to give up, she spotted him. He was sitting on a bench in Central Park, wrapped in a tattered blanket. His eyes were staring off into the distance, and there was a deep sadness in them that made Victoria stop. Gathering her courage, she approached him.
Excuse me,
she began hesitantly. The man raised his eyes to her, and Victoria was struck by their clarity and intelligence.
My name is Victoria, and you are?
The man was silent for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to answer.
Michael,
he finally said in a husky voice.
Michael?
Victoria repeated, taking a seat next to him on the bench.
I have an unusual proposition for you.
She told him about the bet, trying to put it in the best possible light. She talked about the opportunity to change her life, about a new beginning. But the more she talked, the more awkward she felt. Her words sounded false, even to herself. Michael listened silently, not interrupting. When Victoria finished, he stared at her for a long time, as if trying to read something in her eyes.
So you want to use me to win an argument? He
finally asked. Victoria felt the color of shame flood her cheeks.
No, I mean, yes, but not just that. I really want to help.
Michael chuckled bitterly.
You know, Victoria, life on the street teaches you a lot of things. Like the fact that there's only free cheese in a mousetrap. What do you really want from me?
Victoria was taken aback. She had expected gratitude, maybe distrust, but not such a direct challenge.
I don't know.
She admitted honestly.
I guess I want to prove that I can do it, that I can change someone's life.
Have you ever considered that maybe not everyone wants their lives changed?
Michael asked. That question took Victoria by surprise. She had never considered the situation from that perspective.
But don't you want a better life?
She asked, confused. Michael sighed.
A better life. You know, Victoria, everyone has a different understanding of what a better life is. For some, it's money and status. For others, it's freedom and lack of commitment. I'm not sure your idea of a better life is the same as mine.
Victoria felt the ground slipping from under her feet. This was turning out to be much more complicated than she had imagined.
But you can't want to live on the street,
She said in a near whisper.
Why not?
Michael asked.
Maybe it's my choice. Maybe I have my reasons.
Victoria didn't know what to say. She stared at this man, so different from anyone she'd ever known, and felt her whole worldview crumble.
Look,
She finally said,
I realize I started off on the wrong foot. I don't want to use you. I want to understand you, to understand how you live, why you're here. And, you know, if there's anything I can do to help you in the process, I'm happy to do it. No strings attached. What do you say?
Michael stared at her for a long moment, as if assessing the sincerity of her words. Finally, he nodded.
All right, Victoria, let's give it a try. But be warned, it won't be an easy road. Are you sure you're ready?
Victoria took a deep breath.
Yes,
She said.
I'm ready.
The next few days were a real test for Victoria. She was sure that she could quickly solve Michael's problems with the help of money and connections. But the reality turned out to be much more complicated. The first thing Victoria did was to take Michael to the best private clinic in New York. The results of the examination shocked her. Michael was diagnosed with a whole bunch of diseases, from heart problems to the early stages of tuberculosis.
How did you even survive on the street in that condition?
She asked, looking at the test results. Michael shrugged.
Habits, I guess. When you live on the streets, you learned to ignore pain and discomfort.
Victoria felt a lump come up in her throat. She'd never thought about what homeless people went through every day before. The next step was clothes. Victoria took Michael to an expensive boutique on Fifth Avenue, confident that a stylish new closet would make him feel more confident. But Michael felt uncomfortable in the designer clothes.
You know, Victoria,
He said, looking at the price tag of another jacket.
with this money, you could feed a dozen homeless people for a month.
Victoria froze. She had never thought of money in that way. For her, expensive clothes had always been a matter of course, a way to show her status and success. But Michael's words made her look at the situation in a completely different way.
You're right.
She finally said.
Let's look for something more practical.
They finished their shopping at the usual mall, choosing simple but quality clothes. Michael looked much more natural and comfortable in it. The next problem was housing. Victoria wanted to rent Michael an apartment in a luxury apartment complex on the Upper East Side, but he flatly refused.
Oh, I couldn't live in a place like this.
He said.
It's not my world.
In the end, they found a compromise, a small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn. When Michael first entered it, Victoria noticed his hands trembling.
Is everything okay?
She asked anxiously. Michael nodded, unable to utter a word. He walked slowly around the apartment, touching the walls as if he couldn't believe it was real. When he returned to the living room, Victoria saw tears in his eyes.
Thank you.
He said quietly.
I'd forgotten what it was like to have a home of my own.
Victoria felt her own eyes fill with tears. She suddenly realized how privileged her life had been, how many things she had taken for granted.
Michael,
she said.
I know we didn't get off to the best start, but I want you to know I really want to help. Not for the sake of an argument, not for myself, but for you.
Michael stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out how sincere her words were. Finally, he nodded.
I believe you, Victoria, and I'm grateful for everything you do, but, changing a life isn't just about material things. It's about what's inside, and with that, that's going to be harder.
Victoria nodded. She was beginning to realize that she had a long and difficult road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something really important. It had been a week since the experiment had begun. Victoria was sure that now that Michael's basic needs had been met, everything would go smoothly. She was wrong. The first problem was work. Victoria used her connections to get Michael a job as a receptionist at one of her restaurants in Midtown Manhattan. She was sure it was perfect, not too difficult a job, good pay, and the opportunity to socialize with people. 3 days later, however, the restaurant manager called her with a complaint. Michael was absent-minded, frequently made mistakes, and seemed completely disinterested in his work. When Victoria arrived at the restaurant to address the situation, she found Michael sitting in the back room with an absent look in his eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. Michael was silent for a long time before answering.
I can't do this, Victoria. All these people, their inquiries, their complaints, it's too much. I feel like I'm suffocating.
Victoria was puzzled.
But it's just a job, isn't it? Just a normal job that millions of people do.
For you, yes, but
Michael replied.
I don't understand. When you live on the streets, you get used to a certain rhythm of life, to freedom, to a lack of commitment. And here, I feel like I'm in a cage.
Victoria didn't know what to say. She had never thought of work as a cage. For her, work had always been a source of satisfaction, a way to prove her worth.
But how do you plan to live on?
She asked.
After all, you need money to pay the rent, to buy food.
Michael chuckled bitterly.
Victoria, when you have nothing, you realize how little you really need to live. Food? It can be found. A roof over your head? There are shelters. And freedom. Freedom can't be bought with any money.
Victoria felt her plan crumbling. She had thought that the main thing was to give Michael material benefits, a job, status. But it turned out to be a much deeper problem.
What are we going to do?
She asked, confused. Michael looked at her with unexpected warmth.
Victoria, maybe instead of trying to change me, you could just understand me. Understand why I live the way I do, why so many people choose to live this way.
Victoria thought for a moment. She suddenly realized that in all this time she had never once asked Michael about his past, about how he'd ended up on the street, about his dreams and fears.
You're right.
She said finally.
I was too focused on changing your life that I forgot about the most important thing of all. Yourself. Tell me everything.
And Michael began to talk about how he had once had a successful career as a programmer in Silicon Valley, a family, a home, and how it all fell apart because his startup partner betrayed him. Depression, alcoholism, the loss of everything he held dear.
But do you know what the weirdest thing is?
He said, finishing his story.
When I found myself on the street, when I had nothing left, I suddenly felt a strange relief. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was free. Free from obligations, from society's expectations, from having to conform to someone else's standards.
Victoria listened with bated breath. She suddenly realized that she had never felt such freedom in her entire life. There were always obligations, expectations, the need to prove something to herself and others.
But don't you miss having a normal life?
She asked.
For comfort, for security?
Michael hesitated for a moment.
Sometimes,
he admitted.
especially on cold winter nights or when I'm sick. But, this life has taught me to appreciate every moment, every little thing. A warm, sunny day, a passerby's smile, a piece of bread. When you have nothing, you start to appreciate everything.
Victoria felt a lump come up in her throat. She suddenly realized how empty and meaningless her own life had been, filled with the endless pursuit of success and recognition.
Michael,
She said quietly.
I think I'm the one who should be learning from you, not the other way around.
Michael smiled.
Maybe we can learn from each other?
Victoria nodded, feeling something change in her soul. She realized that this bet, which had started as a silly whim, could be the beginning of something much more important and meaningful. In the days that followed, Victoria began to see the world through completely different eyes. She spent more and more time with Michael, listening to his stories, watching him interact with the world. One day they were walking through Central Park when Michael suddenly stopped near a group of street musicians. He listened to them play with such admiration, as if it were a concert at Carnegie Hall.
Aren't they beautiful?
He asked Victoria. She listened. Before, she would have just walked on by without paying attention to the street performers. But now she could hear the beauty in their music, see the passion in their eyes. Yes, she replied, surprised at her own feelings. They're really beautiful. Michael smiled.
You see, Victoria, beauty is all around us. We just have to learn to notice it.
Another time, they ended up at a small diner in Harlem. Victoria had never been to such places before, preferring expensive restaurants, but the sandwich she'd eaten there had tasted better than any gourmet meal she'd ever had.
Do you know what the secret is?
Michael asked, noticing her surprise.
They cook here with love, not to impress or earn a Michelin star. It's just to feed people.
Victoria reflected. Once upon a time, when she had just started her business, she too had cooked with love. When had that changed? When had food become just a way for her to make money and impress? Every day, Victoria became more and more immersed in Michael's world, a world she had never even known existed before. She got to know his friends, former homeless people who, despite all the hardships, remained optimistic and human. There was John, a former English teacher who now gave free lessons to disadvantaged children on the street. There was Maria, a talented artist whose paintings adorned the walls of abandoned buildings. There was Peter, who cooked soup every day for his fellow survivors, using whatever food he could find. As Victoria listened to their stories, her heart filled with both pain and admiration. She began to realize that behind the label homeless were real people with dreams, talents, and stories.
How can we help them?
She asked Michael one day. He looked at her in surprise.
Are you sure you want to help, or do you just want to feel better?
Victoria thought for a moment. Before, she would have just written a check to charity and forgotten about it. But now she wanted something more.
I want to help for real,
She said.
but I don't know how.
Michael smiled.
Victoria, sometimes the biggest help is just being there, to listen, to understand, not to judge.
And Victoria began to learn how to do it. She spent hours talking to people on the streets, listening to their stories, trying to understand their problems and needs. She learned that what many homeless people lack is not so much money, but opportunity. Opportunities to get an education, to find a job, to get medical care. And then an idea began to form in Victoria's mind. An idea that could change not only Michael's life, but many other people's lives as well. Victoria sat in her office, looking at the panorama of New York outside the window. Not so long ago, that view had filled her with pride and a sense of her own importance. Now she saw the city differently, with all its problems, its injustices, but also its potential for change. She remembered all the stories she'd heard over the past weeks. Stories of talented people on the street because of unforeseen circumstances. Stories of people who wanted to get back to normal, but didn't know where to start. And that's when it hit her. Victoria grabbed her cell phone and dialed Michael's number.
Michael, I have an idea,
She said as soon as he answered.
but I need your help.
An hour later, they met at a small cafe. Victoria, excited and enthusiastic, began to outline her plan.
We're going to create a foundation,
She said.
but not a regular charitable foundation. We will create a platform that will help homeless people realize their talents and skills.
Michael listened with interest, but also with some skepticism. And how do you envision that? Victoria began to explain. She talked about creating educational programs tailored to the needs of homeless people, about partnering with local businesses to create jobs, providing temporary housing and medical care.
But most importantly,
She said.
we will treat these people not as objects of charity, but as equals. We will help them unlock their potential, find their place in society.
Michael listened, and his skepticism was gradually replaced by interest.
Sounds ambitious,
He said finally.
but how are you going to finance it?
Victoria smiled.
I'll sell my share of the restaurant business. That will give us some startup capital, and then I'm sure there will be people who will want to support such an initiative.
Michael shook his head.
Are you willing to give up everything you've built for this idea?
Not give up.
Victoria corrected him.
To change direction, use your skills and resources for something really important.
They talked for several hours, discussing the details of the plan. Michael shared his experience and knowledge of life on the street, helping Victoria to see potential problems and find solutions. By the end of the conversation, both were enthusiastic.
You know, Victoria,
Michael said.
I think this could work, but you need to realize that it won't be easy. You're going to face a lot of obstacles, a lot of misunderstanding, maybe even hostility.
Victoria nodded. I know, but I'm ready for this. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something really important. The next day, Victoria sprang into action. She contacted her lawyers to begin the process of creating a nonprofit organization. She met with her partners in the restaurant business to discuss selling her share. The reaction was predictable. Many thought she had lost her mind. Her partners were shocked by her decision to sell a successful business. Her friends didn't understand why she would do that. Vika, are you crazy? Emily's best friend said to her during lunch. You're going to trade everything you've accomplished for some charity? Victoria looked at her friend calmly.
This isn't just a charity, Em. It's a chance to change people's lives, to make the world a little better.
Emily shook her head. But why you? Why not leave it to the professionals?
Because I can do it.
Victoria replied simply.
I have the resources, the connections, the management experience, and now I have an inside understanding of the problem thanks to Michael.
Emily frowned. Speaking of that Michael guy, are you sure he's not manipulating you, not using you? Victoria laughed. Believe me, Em, if anyone was trying to take advantage of anyone, it's me, him. But you know what? In the process, I learned more from him than I could have ever imagined. Despite the misunderstanding of those around her, Victoria continued to work on her project. She rented a small office in Brooklyn and began to assemble a team of like-minded people. The first person she invited was, of course, Michael.
I want you to be my co-director. Your experience and understanding of the situation is invaluable to us.
Michael hesitated. Are you sure? I mean, I have no management experience, no education. At least you have something none of us have, a real understanding of the problem, Victoria replied.
We'll learn the rest together.
Gradually, the team grew. Sarah, a social worker with years of experience working with the homeless, joined them. Jake, a young lawyer willing to work pro bono to help with the legal aspects, came in. Even John, a former English teacher whom Victoria met on the street, became part of the team, taking over the education programs. Victoria worked day and night, putting all her energy and resources into the project. She met with potential partners, negotiated with city authorities, and developed programs. But the closer they got to launching the project, the more problems arose. Bureaucratic hurdles, lack of funding, skepticism from the public. All these sometimes seemed insurmountable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day full of rejections and disappointments, Victoria sat in her office feeling completely devastated. Maybe everyone was right? Maybe she really was crazy to have started all this? At that moment, Michael entered the office. He silently sat down next to Victoria and for a while just sat there, looking out the window at the Brooklyn night skyline.
You know, Victoria,
He finally said,
when I first found myself on the street, I thought my life was over. I saw no way out, no future. But then I realized one important thing. As long as you're alive, you always have a chance to change things.
He turned to her. What you're doing, it's giving people that chance. A chance at a new life, a new beginning. And believe me, it means more to a lot of people than you can imagine. Victoria felt tears come to her eyes.
Thank you, Michael.
She said quietly.
Sometimes I forget what it's all about.
Michael smiled.
Then let me remind you. Come with me.
He took Victoria to a small shelter they had recently opened as part of their project. There they were met by a group of people, the very homeless people they were trying to help.
Look,
Michael said, pointing to a young guy sitting at a computer.
that's Alex. A month ago he was sleeping on the street. Now he's learning programming and will soon go to an internship at an IT company.
He pointed to a middle-aged woman practicing with a group of children.
And this is Maria. She used to be a teacher but lost her job and her home due to illness. Now she is teaching again, helping children from disadvantaged families.
Victoria looked at these people, at their faces full of hope and determination, and felt the energy and confidence awaken in her again.
You're right, Michael.
She said.
We can't give up. There's too much at stake.
The next day, Victoria returned to work with renewed vigor. She redoubled her efforts, looking for new ways to solve problems, new sources of funding, new partners, and gradually things started to get better. A local IT company agreed to provide free programming courses for program participants. A chain of coffee shops offered jobs for those who were undergoing rehabilitation. Even the city authorities, seeing the first successes of the project, began to show interest and offer support. But the biggest success stories were those of people whose lives began to change thanks to the project. Every day, Victoria heard new success stories about people who found jobs, restored relationships with their families, and returned to normal life. One day, an elderly woman approached Victoria. "Are you Ms. Goldberg?" she asked. Victoria nodded, not quite sure what to expect. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said with tears in her eyes. "My son, he's been on the streets for years. I thought I had lost him forever. But thanks to your program, he was able to get back to a normal life. He is with me again. You gave me my son back." Victoria was touched to the core. She hugged the woman, feeling her own eyes fill with tears. In that moment, she realized that all the hardships, all the doubts, all the sleepless nights were worth it. She was really making a difference in people's lives. It's been 6 months since the project began. The Victoria Foundation, which they have named A New Beginning, has already helped hundreds of people. Their rehabilitation and training programs have been recognized not only in New York, but also in other cities across the country. Victoria was completely absorbed in her work when one morning she received a call from James Watrowski, the very competitor she had made a bet with.
Victoria, we need to meet,"
he said in a serious tone.
"It's a better argument."
Victoria was surprised. She'd almost forgotten about the bet, so insignificant it now seemed compared to what she was doing. They met at the same restaurant where it had all started. James looked unusually serious.
"Victoria,"
he began.
"I must admit that I underestimated you. What you've done, it's impressive."
Victoria was surprised at this start to the conversation.
Thank you, James, but I'm sure you didn't call me here to compliment me.
James nodded.
"You're right. The thing is, I want to join your project."
Victoria was shocked.
You? But why?
James took a deep breath.
"Because you opened my eyes, Victoria. I've been following your work all these months, and I've realized that you're doing something really important, something that could change the world for the better."
He was silent for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts.
You know, I always thought success was measured in money and power, but looking at you, at what you do, I realized that real success is the ability to make a difference in someone's life.
Victoria was touched by James's sincerity.
And what do you suggest?
She asked.
I want to invest in your fund,
James replied.
not just the million we were arguing about. I'm willing to invest a significant portion of my fortune. And not just money. I want to be involved in the foundation to use my connections and experience to help expand your programs.
Victoria was stunned. She had never expected this turn of events.
James, I don't know what to say.
James smiled.
Say yes, Victoria. Let's do something really meaningful together.
Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. She held out her hand to James.
Yes,
She said.
let's do this together.
James's involvement opened up new opportunities for the New Beginnings Foundation. With his investment and connections, they were able to expand their programs, open new centers in other cities, and help even more people. But the most important thing was that the example of Victoria and James inspired other businessmen and celebrities. People who used to donate to charity only for tax benefits now began to actively participate in social projects. A year has passed since the project began. New Beginning has become one of the most successful and respected charitable organizations in the country. Thousands of people got a chance for a new life thanks to their programs. Victoria was sitting in her office, reviewing reports on the foundation's work, when there was a knock on the door. It was Michael.
I have a surprise for you.
He said with a mysterious smile.
Let's go.
They got into the car and drove toward Central Park. As they approached the place where they had first met a year ago, Victoria saw a group of people gathered around a bench. As they got closer, Victoria recognized the men. They were the same homeless people she had met at the beginning of her journey, but they looked different now, well-groomed, confident, with smiles on their faces. "Surprise!" they shouted in unison when they saw Victoria. John, a former English teacher, stepped forward. "Victoria, we wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us, for believing in us when no one else did." Maria, the artist, held out a painting to Victoria. It was the same bench where Victoria had first met Michael, but all around her were people smiling, happy, full of life. "That's us," Maria said. "The before and the after. You changed our lives, Victoria." Victoria was so moved that she could not utter a word. She looked at these people, at their transformed faces, and felt her heart overflow with emotion. Michael put his hand on her shoulder.
You see, Victoria, you really have changed the world. Maybe not the whole world at once, but for these people, you've changed everything.
Victoria finally found the strength to speak.
No, Michael,
She said, wiping away her tears.
we changed the world. All of us, together. And we're going to keep doing it.
5 years later, Victoria stood on stage accepting an award for her outstanding contribution to homelessness. Next to her stood Michael, now her husband and partner in every sense of the word.
When I began this journey,
Victoria said in her speech,
I thought I was going to change someone's life. But the truth is, it is my life that has changed the most. I learned to see the value in every person, regardless of their status or position. I realized that true wealth is not measured in money, but in the ability to make the world a better place.
She looked at Michael, then at the audience where hundreds of people sat, whose lives had been changed by New Beginnings.
We all deserve a second chance,
She continued.
and sometimes in helping others, we find our best selves. Thank you all for being a part of this amazing journey. And remember, each of us can change the world. We just need to take the first step.
When Victoria finished her speech, the room erupted in applause. She looked at Michael, and they both smiled, remembering how it had all started with one bet, one meeting, one decision, to see the world through different eyes. They knew that their work was not yet done, that there were still many challenges and difficulties ahead, but they also knew that together they could overcome everything. Because they had found their calling, their way to make the world a little better. And every time she passed that bench in Central Park, Victoria stopped for a moment, remembering how it all began. And every time she felt grateful for the second chance she had gotten, for the opportunity to change people's lives, and for having found her true calling Because at the end of the day, the greatest treasure is the ability to make a difference in someone's life. And Victoria knew she'd found her true treasure.